Hello everyone, welcome. I want to thank Melissa for that very kind introduction and for bringing all of this together and stepping in as the host because Carol's sick. Also, thanks to all of you. Both the classes, I know the two classes who were here you were told you needed to be here, but still you're here. So that's wonderful, I appreciate it. And all the other guests, faculty and students who are here. It's a busy time of the semester, so I really am grateful to see you in the room today. There's a handout on your chairs, which I decided last night, why not? How many of you have heard anything about Cyclone Idai in Mozambique? Those of you who are in my class, yes, you have. Yeah. How many of you have not heard anything? Yeah, actually that's a lower number than I thought. It happened 2.5 weeks ago, so maybe things are trickling into the news. It's one of those extremely rare times when Mozambique appears in the US news, but it's appeared very fleetingly, so if you haven't heard of it, it's not your fault. It's the fault of bigger structures at work that keep these kinds of events out of the news. Some description, a quick overview is in the handout you have, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it. I just could not give a talk about Mozambique today without addressing what's happening in Mozambique right now, which is a climate change related weather event, disaster of really catastrophic proportions, and it's expected that many thousands of people will end up having lost their lives. They're still digging out from under floodwaters and destroyed homes and bridges and roads and infrastructure. So if you've seen anything in the news here, please know that it's a lot worse than it looks in the news. And so this is why the reason for the handout today. These are the numbers to date. They're the official numbers. They don't reflect anything near what they will end up being the case. I didn't want to bring you, there are all kinds of pictures online showing the human tragedies of this event, which happened on March 14th when Cyclone Idai kind of slammed into the city of Beira, Mozambique's second biggest city, now being called the first city to be completely devastated by climate change. This is a picture of the floodwaters, most recently from March 25th. So the dark blue is the sort of still seriously flooded areas that represent the extension of the inundation. Just to give you a sense of how large the area is, according to someone who wrote about this recently, the area that's affected in total is more than the areas of New York City, Chicago, Boston, and Washington, D.C. combined. So this is a vast area of a country that's already extremely poor, in a region that is politically unstable and has been unstable since the mid-1970s and is the seat of a rebel movement that launched a 16-year civil war. There is a very difficult future for this region ahead, in particular because it's an extremely rural area and the entire populations of this region that was affected lost not only this year's food supply, they were about to harvest. The harvest was a couple of weeks away. They lost their entire food supply for the year, along with their seed stores for next year, their livestock, which is their main source of wealth, and any sort of farming infrastructure that people rely on as farming people. So this is a catastrophic event. It'll get worse. And if you are at all moved to donate anywhere, I put 3 organizations at the bottom of that handout, which are, I'm in contact with people who are working there right now, and these are their recommendations for the best places. If you, $5, anything is helpful for this effort. And I'd be happy to talk more about this later at the end of the talk. Okay, so the talk itself, I thought I'd give you, so my class was asked to read the paper that just came out, which I will be talking from in part for the first half, I guess, or so of the talk. But I know the other class, Professor Dan Ouden's class, read a different piece of mine from a while back representing my early research. So I thought I'd give a kind of quick overview of what I've been doing in Mozambique since, it says 1994, but Melissa was right, I've been working there since 1992. Just the 1992 visit, which was still during the Civil War, was very strange and complicated, and I don't really remember much of it. I mean, I was there, you couldn't really travel anywhere, and there was gunfire outside the city at night. So I count the research as having actually started in 1994. Showing you the map of Mozambique, because I'm assuming lots of people don't know where it is. Tiny map of Africa, down in the southeast here, neighboring South Africa, a little bit of Swaziland, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia, a little bit, and Tanzania in the north. It's an extraordinarily well, it's a large country, it's an extraordinarily diverse country, it's an extraordinarily weirdly shaped country, as you can see, as a result of colonial borders being drawn by Germany, Britain, and Portugal in the 1880s and 1890s. Mozambique has one of the longest coastlines in Africa. The coastline is over 1,500 miles long, so just to give you a sense of the scale. So I've indicated here where I've been doing research. Down here in Magud, those of you who read the I'll Bury You in the Border paper is based on the research I did here in the south of the country between 94 and 97. And then from 2007, in 2007, I began doing work in this area up here, which is exactly in the path, of the impact of the cyclone. Where my research is really here, and this is an area that's also been quite devastated. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, and then Zavala, which is mostly what I'll be talking about today, is here. So the early research in Magud in the south, just to give you a quick idea of sort of how I got to where I am now and the kinds of research that I'm going to be talking about today. My earliest research, which was my PhD dissertation research, was really looking at how we reconstruct the long history of rural women in a part of Africa that is, at the time I did this research, was kind of officially listed as the poorest country in the world, where literacy rates are extremely low, where rural women do not appear in archival sources really very much at all. And when they do, and those of you who aren't history majors or historians, you need archival documents to understand and reconstruct the past. Rural African women, in the records written by European colonizers, in this case from Portugal, either are absent from historical records until the really mid-20th century, or if they appear in extremely stereotyped and racist ways. So I really wanted to know, how do we then understand the history of these women if their written records don't exist? So I went to this community, Magud. I lived there for almost a year and a half, and I spent a lot of time hanging out with old women, which was I had 100 grandmothers. It was wonderful, and talking to them and kind of observing them and experiencing with them how they created memories of their histories and what forms they kept them in. And so I ended up doing a lot of very in-depth work looking at everything from women's storytelling, and that includes stories they would tell about their lives and all their female relatives. There are these sort of fascinating genres of life storytelling that women do, along with more fictional storytelling like fables. So that was one of the things I looked at. This is a photograph from a very early anthropology study on ethnography from right around 1900. And this is a scene that's very typical now as well. A group of women who, their neighbors, their friends, their relatives, or visitors from elsewhere, who sit in large groups on the ground and just talk. And while they're talking, they're shelling peanuts, or they're picking greens off of the leaves they brought in. They're doing work, but they're also telling stories. And so that was one of the sort of genres of history telling I looked at. I also looked at women's pottery, women's body marking practices, and then the one that Professor Den Ouden's class read about looking at how women use the boundaries between their fields, where their crops were, as a way of remembering relationships over generations between women and the families they married into. And if you're looking at that cornfield, it's probably pretty hard to see a distinct boundary, and that was really the point. The idea was that women carved boundaries in the sand with their hoes in very sort of snaky ways that you had to really have trust in the neighboring field owner in order to trust that they weren't going to be stealing their land, your land from you by chipping away the border. And the reading that the Gender, Culture, and Power class did looked at a situation after the Civil War where women were resettling, and very serious, in some cases life or death conflicts emerged because women were stealing each other's fields by chipping away at their borders. So why was I looking, or what did I come up with after looking at how women tell their histories? This is something I can talk more about during the seminar section if anyone's interested, but what I came out with was an extremely profoundly different understanding of the sort of narrative of change in this area of Mozambique since about 1800 to the present, and women's these particular genres of historical memory making, in them women really focused on remembering the networks of support that enabled them to survive in a very, very difficult physical and political environment. So remembering relationships was at the core, and the histories that women told through these forms were histories of how marriage and fictive kinship and friendship and communities of healing, how those relationships among women changed over time, and how they enabled women to really deal with a number of terrible challenges, Portuguese colonialism being one of them, but also 19th century conquest by an expanding kingdom. So lots going on in POTS and body marks, women's tattoos, that I'm happy to talk more about later. Now, it's very different from what I'm talking about today, obviously, and that's because I finished my dissertation research and I had an academic position, and then in 2000, if any of you have been reading anything about the current cyclone in Mozambique, in the year 2000, that was the most recent catastrophic weather event in Mozambique, and it hit mostly in the south, and it hit exactly the area of Magud where I'd been doing my research, which was right up here. I was a professor at the time, and I knew that many people, families that I'd worked with, had either lost their lives. I think nearly 1,000 people, I think the death toll, 900 or 1,000 people from that event. And also that the area was completely devastated, and I made the decision after that point that I wasn't so comfortable being a history professor anymore, that I wanted to do something that was, that at the time, this was, it was kind of a traumatic moment, I think, really, in my thinking about what my purpose in the world was. And so I left my academic position and I started working, as Melissa mentioned, as a rural livelihoods consultant, working with teams of people who were doing research in African contexts on things like how do you reduce poverty in very vulnerable rural areas, how do you develop policies that do a better job of ensuring food security, how do you recognize women's knowledge in particular as something, a vital resource to bring to policy discussions about poverty reduction in African countries. So I worked for the series for about 10 years, a series of projects. One of them, and this is the backdrop to the book project I'm working on, in central Mozambique, I worked with a group of researchers who were natural resource economists and remote sensing specialists who did all kinds of cool things with maps that I couldn't at the time understand. But I was their kind of history and culture consultant. And what we were looking at, that green dot, the green space in the map up there, is Gorongosa National Park, a very famous conservation biodiversity protection area in central Mozambique, which was devastated by the Civil War. And it was in and is still in the process of being rebuilt in some quite controversial ways. And so we were looking at how rural households living around the park, what role the natural resources that the park was keeping them away from, what role those resources played or should have played in their livelihoods. So we're basically trying to understand, how does conservation work with rural development in very poor parts of Africa? And how can maybe we develop policies that might give people access to resources like forests and rivers and wildlife and beekeeping, which is why these pictures are here. Just to illustrate, this is one of the things that people in this area have lost access to, is a very, very important and very lucrative source of income from beekeeping, which has been happening in this area for hundreds of years. These are hives that the men make, and they climb up really, really tall trees and plant them in the trees, and then after a while they go back and they use smoke to get the bees to come out, and they harvest the honey and they sell it in the city, in Beira, for lots of money. And that livelihood they've lost as a result of the national park. These are some children gathering wild foods, wild roots that are very nutritious and important during times of low rainfall, and it's another activity and food source that people lost because of the rules around protecting biodiversity in Gorongosa Park. So that was another project where this here really started to look at the ways that rural women's knowledge and rural women's expertise about food provisioning, how that was important to understand for developing policies around food security. That unless you really talk to the people who were managing the food supply, which is the women, that you wouldn't really be able to understand what policies would do to them if they weren't carefully thought out and didn't carefully take women's histories and women's knowledge into account. Okay, so that was 2000, that was the transition work I got into after 2000, after the crisis of the 2000 flood in Mozambique, and then another crisis, this time the world food price crisis in 2008, 2007 and 8, and then another round of it in 2010 is what propelled me into the research that I'm doing now that I'm going to talk to you about today. There was something I was going to say about that crisis, but it's left. Okay, so New Green Revolution for Africa. How many in here know what the Green Revolution was? Nick, nice to see you.
I would say it was Norman Borlaug, was that his name?
Borlaug.
Yeah, he genetically modified certain crops so they were nutritious.
Okay.
That's as concise as I can be, how to think things.
Yeah. Good, yep. So he developed higher yielding strains of key food crops, in particular wheat and corn, the idea was to use these new strains of high yielding grains, which needed to be grown with chemical fertilizers and pesticides, to use this as a way to increase food supply in poor parts of the world, Mexico, India, China. Very controversial, a sort of separate story we can talk about later. What has come up in recent years, officially beginning about 2006, is something referred to as the New Green Revolution for Africa, because the first Green Revolution passed Africa by. That's the language that people use about it. In 2006, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundations launched this initiative. They created an organization called the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, or AGRA, and this was based in Nairobi, Kenya, the purpose of which was to really put kind of an African face and African leadership on what was, in fact, a Rockefeller and Gates Foundation driven development agenda with all kinds of corporate connections that I'll touch on a little bit in the rest of my talk. The idea of the New Green Revolution for Africa was that because this world food price crisis in 2008, when food prices skyrocketed and we started to see political uprisings over food, Arab Spring is a result of the food price crisis. In Mozambique in 2010, there was rioting over the price of bread that resulted in about a dozen people being shot by the police. So the idea was, all right, Africa has a hunger problem. This was the language that was used at the time. And so the Rockefeller and Gates Foundations decided that the best way to solve Africa's hunger problem at this time was to find ways and invest and develop ways to connect smallholder farmers, especially women, to commercial markets so that they could, one, earn income by selling their crops instead of just eating what they grew, and two, so that women farmers, poor farmers, could have access to so-called modern technologies, improved farm inputs, high-yield variety seeds, the kinds of things that Borlaug developed during the first Green Revolution. The idea with AGRA, with the Green Revolution, is that African governments, African countries, would work in partnership with Western governments, Western donors, philanthropic foundations like the Gates Foundation and Rockefeller, private sector investors, international research centers, and development agencies. That all of these organizations and governments would come together and work on building something that they described as an agricultural value chains. Probably, you may not have heard of the term value chain, but you've probably heard of the term supply chain. And basically they're the same thing, but the language, the packaging is a little different, because when you call it value chain, the idea is that the supply chain or the value chain is what links the producer of a good, right, of a raw material, to the end consumer and connects that producer through service providers, input suppliers, processors, retailers, et cetera, ultimately to the end user, the consumer. So when you talk about it as a value chain, and this idea of value chains really came out of this New Green Revolution for Africa, the idea is that to tell people, and this is the theory, that at every step in the chain, as you move from one step of the chain to the next, value is added. So that instead of a farmer just taking his or her, sorghum, and selling it by the side of the road and getting one price for it, that sorghum in a value chain would be, what's the word? The production would be enriched through the addition of these new modern inputs. Then the producer would be able to sell it for a higher price. Then it would go and get processed, and then profit would be made on selling the processed result of the sorghum, et cetera, et cetera. So it was all about adding value to the crops that smallholder farmers in Africa were already growing. There are more cynical ways of referring to this sort of model for agricultural development, and I've got this slide. This is a kind of famous diagram that was built to like diagram the idea of the value chain, and this one here, for agricultural value chains, also, I don't know how well you can see the text there, but it goes from farmers to service providers to middlemen, financial services, et cetera, up to consumers. So these are all nicely modelable things. And they were also, just to go back here, because it'd be distracting to see those UMass Boston shirts up there. Another way of thinking about this model, and lots of other people have written about this, is as the term that often gets used is philanthrocapitalism, where it's basically philanthropy but done like a business, following the practices of businesses where you're making a profit, but you're doing good at the same time. And this is very much in keeping with the sort of dominant approach to development in Africa now, which is to base development around market interventions. Neoliberalism is another word that you may have heard that's useful for thinking about this, where the idea is that the market will solve all problems, that all you need to do is connect everybody to markets, and then everything will be much better. So all this talk was going on in like the late 2000s, and then I began to get interested in it because Mozambique was very keen on new Green Revolution strategies and development approaches. So I happened to be very lucky and got to know somebody back in 2011 at the University of Minnesota who was similarly trying to figure out what to make about this new Green Revolution for Africa, and what was it doing and why did it sound so ridiculously colonial and how was it, what kind of impact was it going to have on people. And so just sort of to make a long story short, this is my research team right now. I'm doing a case study on Mozambique. My colleague Bill, Burkina Faso, is looking at rice. Another colleague Tom, cashews in Cote d'Ivoire. And then Rachel and William Monroe are looking at analyzing sort of the foundations and their role in this green revolution. So we have, Melissa mentioned, we have this wonderful National Science Foundation grant for 5 years to look at what particular Green Revolution agricultural projects are doing to rural communities and their livelihoods, and in particular to their food security, because the model of the Green Revolution is that connecting smallholder farmers to markets, especially women farmers, is going to end hunger in Africa. That's the claim they make. I should note that they have no evidence. There's no evidence-based sort of foundation for this programming, but that's the claim they make. And then also in the spirit of giving credit where credit's due, I could not put a picture of my wonderful Mozambican research assistants, Justino Nyabindi and Alcina Comé, without whom I couldn't do any of this research in Mozambique. And they're knowing that they were on a slide at UMass Boston with their UMass Boston t-shirts on would just like make me so happy that I had to put them up there. But they are very much a part of this project, and their knowledge and experience has been crucial as well. Okay, so to today's topic, the title of the talk. In 2009, in the wake of the global food price crisis and with the soaring price of barley malt, the South African beverage giant SAB Miller, which, if you follow beer, was purchased in 2016 by Anheuser-Busch, and so now it's no longer this great independent company, but part of a ridiculous conglomerate of beverage makers. So SAB Miller decided in 2009 that it needed to explore the possibility of producing in Africa the world's first cassava-based commercial beer. Now, why on earth would they want to do this? People have been brewing beer in Africa, and I would say women, for the most part, have been brewing beer in Africa for millennia. But we have Europeans to thank for introducing industrial beer brewing, so commercial factory beer brewing, to the African continent. That beer has been historically based on wheat and barley. And SAB Miller in particular, because this is such a great example, started in South Africa in 1895. So commercial beer brewing has a really long history, or a longer history in Africa than one might expect. Now, over the course of the 20th century, during the period of colonial rule in Africa, European commercial beers started to replace women's home brews to varying degrees. So the beers that women had been brewing at home from grains like sorghum and millet and maize more recently, but also liquors they distilled from basically any kind of fruit that they can find. There's a very deep and very technically sophisticated distilling culture as well in many parts of Africa. But European beers did not completely replace women's home brews in rural areas, because in rural communities they've been for a very long time very important sources of nutrients, of calories, ways to use your grains that can be ways to extend the usefulness of your grain harvest. So has been and was during the period of colonial rule a lot of competition actually between European commercial beer makers and women beer brewers. And so you see some stories, South Africa has some famous ones, and Kenya as well, and Tanzania, of sort of women beer brewers banding together to sort of try to prevent European beer makers from taking over their market. So there's a whole really fascinating history of beer in Africa as well. Now, SAB Miller, which has breweries in 15 countries in Africa, it's really an enormous operation, had a very good experience in Uganda with a beer they made from locally sourced sorghum, so an indigenous grain to that part of Africa, Eagle beer. Eagle beer was released in 2004. It was very popular because it was priced very low. And this quote, I love and hate this quote of one of the sort of head honchos at SAB Miller back in the earlier 2000s, was very explicit about why they were making these beers that would be priced more affordably. They're trying to capture a market that was still relying on women's home brews, because a lot of people were too poor to be able to buy commercial beer, bottled beer themselves. So this is a rurally oriented product. We want people to gravitate into what is highly aspirational for them, but to some extent unaffordable, with an entry-level beer. So their language was explicitly about, we want to capture the market of poor people by selling a lower priced beer so that they will start, so that we can woo them away from drinking the beer that their wives and mothers and sisters make at home. So there was a very, sort of deliberate strategy to get more people drinking more beer. But what was interesting, actually, before I go there, in their language as well, is that SAB Miller also made a big deal out of advertising what it said were the social impact benefits and the health benefits of getting more and more poor African peoples to drink bottled beer instead of homebrew beer. So there were many stories about how dangerous women's homebrews were, and many stories about how it really was sort of in the interest of African public health to wean people off of homebrews to start drinking bottled beer. And this is an SAB Miller slogan, making a difference through beer, which I don't know if any beer companies in this country, if you see ads on TV that talk about trying to make a social difference with beer, I'm not, to me that seems like a fairly unique kind of marketing strategy. But they got a lot of traction, a lot of mileage out of this. Some years later, so this is 2004, the Uganda beer came out, the sorghum beer. Some years later, some folks from SAB Miller visited Nigeria, and there they met up with a Dutch company, which I have to my slide here, named DATCO, which stands for the Dutch Agricultural and Trading Company. And DATCO in Nigeria had developed an innovative technology, the Automated Mobile Processing Unit, or AMPU, as I'm going to refer to it for the rest of the talk, the AMPU. The AMPU made possible the takeoff of a commercial cassava flour industry in Nigeria. This technology. Now, basically what this technology, well, wait a minute. I won't tell you about the technology just yet. Cassava roots. So I've got a picture here of cassava. I can't see ahead to my slides. Okay, here. This is what cassava looks like, for those of you who haven't seen it before. It grows, if you can see this is wonderful in showing like the size, the relative size. So this is a woman farmer in Zavala. Cassava is a tree, a sort of tree, a bushy tree plant, and the roots are what you eat. You can also eat the leaves, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So cassava grows these great big roots, They're very, very starchy. They're very high in water content. And the problem with them, if you want to produce them in any kind of commercial way, is that they spoil within 24 to 48 hours of harvest because they're so full of water. So, cassava on the one hand. The DACO technology here, the AMPU, which is basically a processing machine that is put into a truck container, and then it can be moved from place to place. Their motto was bringing the factory to the farmer. The idea here was that they would take this processor around to areas of cassava production. Farmers would sell their cassava to them, and then they would process the cassava for them and sell that processed cassava to the beer companies. So cassava starch could replace the malt, the barley malt source that was used to make the wheat-based beers previously. So, because cassava has this challenge that it perishes within 24 to 48 hours of harvest, you can't. It's really hard to it's also really bulky, so it's really hard to transport anywhere. So this AMPU was really sort of revolutionary in saying that you could now, instead of having to transport cassava and risk it spoiling, you could have it processed on site. So this technology, and here the cassava roots are run through the processor, and then they're made into something called cassava cake, which is this gloppy white stuff that can last for 12 to 18 months. So it works for commercialized uses, for industrial uses, because you can ship the cassava cake to a factory and it can sit there a while before it's used. So cassava was very appealing to S.A.B. Miller as a source of beer for a number of reasons, in addition to the fact that they had this AMPU technology that was now available to them. For one thing, producers in Africa grow over 50% of the world's cassava output, with about 500 million people in Africa relying on cassava as their staple food. So after maize, cassava is the #1 staple food crop across the African continent. So there's a lot of it. S.A.B. Miller hired research consultants to do sort of a scoping study on the prospects of making beer out of cassava, and these consultants assured the brewer that in southern Africa, smallholder farmers grew way more cassava than they needed for consumption. So there would always be a surplus available of this particular crop. Cassava, they thought, was also what was called a poor man's crop, that nobody really wanted to be eating it anyway, so maybe farmers would be happier to just sell it instead of having to use it as their staple food. And they also, sort of the added selling point of using cassava is that in most parts of Africa, cassava is a women's crop. And because women dominated cassava production, the belief of S.A.B. Miller, in keeping with this GR4, Green Revolution for Africa development model, is that women are the key to solving Africa's food security problems. And if cassava is grown by women, if projects went in and worked with women to start commercializing their cassava to sell to the beer company to make this beer, then women would be empowered through their access, this is all their language, women would be empowered through their access to new income, gender equality would improve, and women would use all their new income to feed their families more food and healthier food. So cassava seemed like a sort of win-win crop for S.A.B. Miller to use as a source for a new beer. International crop scientists were hard at work at the time, and still are, trying to create varieties of cassava that will yield more and more. So the beer company is very excited about the prospect of further profits down the road. So it seemed like a project that would both feed a brewery, a raw material that was locally sourced and cheap, and feed hungry families. This is like a no-brainer, right? Like everybody's going to benefit from a project like this. Best of all was the fact that right next to South Africa was Mozambique, a country, as I mentioned, that the government was extremely excited about the Green Revolution approach to African development. In Mozambique, farmers grew 6 to 10 tons of cassava every year, so there was a lot of it around. And this was seen as a bonus, Mozambique had and still has critically high poverty and malnutrition rates. So it was like a place, look, if we're going to go and do good as a beer company, let's go to a place where people are really badly off, are really suffering, are really hungry, are really poor. So Mozambique seemed just like an ideal place to launch this experiment. 44% of Mozambique's population today, and this is also was true 10 years ago, 44% of the population is chronically malnourished. So long-term hunger is a serious, and long-term food insecurity is a serious problem. So Mozambique. The other advantage is that Mozambique's national brewery, the Cervejas de Mozambique, is a subsidiary of SAB Miller. So SAB Miller owns Mozambique's breweries, and lo and behold, the 3 breweries in Mozambique are located, at least 2 of them, in areas of the highest cassava production in the country. So up here in Nampula, and down here there's a brewery in Maputo, and very close to this very high cassava area, which Zavala is part of, that I'll be talking about today. So that was a good advantage as well. So from the brewer's perspective, this was a great project. They had to go forward. DATCO would need, I don't expect you to read this, it's a terrible slide, but it's here to illustrate something, not the words themselves, but just like the terribleness of the slide. So in order to make this work, this effort to source cassava from Mozambique, process it, send it to the brewery in Mozambique to make a new cassava beer. In order for this to work, DATCO, the processor, was going to have to work with a big, long list of other partners in Mozambique to solve a really big problem, which was that in order for the AMPU to function, to operate, not at a loss, it had to be able to process 40 to 60 tons of cassava roots every day. Now, with the yield rate, the amount of cassava that Mozambican farmers produced, that was a ridiculous number. The AMPU was not, they were not going to be able to get that. So the thing that had to happen was that DATCO had to work with, these are the sort of categories of partners: research centers developing high yield varieties of cassava, seed companies that were selling them, fertilizer companies that were facilitating fertilizer distribution, government entities like the Ministry of Agriculture, Western donors like USAID, Mozambican NGOs, and local government agencies all had to be brought into this project in order to work with cassava farmers to make them grow more cassava, to increase their yields from what was then like 3 to 6 tons per hectare to 30 tons per hectare. So that's the dramatic increase that they were looking for. So this chart is really just to kind of show you how sort of crazily elaborate some of these schemes were. Now, in addition, so what these partners would all do, let's see what next. Yeah. What these partners would do, they each had a different and important role, and I won't go over them in detail, but just sort of very quickly, partners needed to, on the one hand, breed and multiply and distribute these new improved varieties of cassava to farmers. They needed to distribute fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides. And initially, in the first 2 years of the project, they gave all that stuff away for free. Now, this is a very important thing to keep in mind, because it affects how women responded to this initiative down the road. They gave all this stuff away to farmers for free, but then they also decided that they had to train farmers very thoroughly in how to use these modern technologies, so-called, and how to, where's the quote? They had to be trained in how to be entrepreneurs and how to market their crops, because according to the people in this constellation of partners, cassava farmers in Mozambique, and they thought everywhere, lived only by bartering and practically never had seen or owned money. Now, this belief becomes really important sort of as the project unfolds. So there was this idea, this is DATCO publicity material, and it talks about how DATCO supports farmers with know-how. They hire mobilizers who are local Mozambican people to go out and learn how to properly plant the cassava and how to treat it with the herbicides, how to, the big thing women also had to start to do was to plant cassava much more densely and to monocrop it instead of planting it with other crops. Again, I'll come back to that in a second. So all this training would be needed to turn women, especially we're talking about women here, who were said to be just poor, ignorant subsistence farmers with no market experience, to turn them into commercial farmers who could sell their cassava as a cash crop and make money and then end their problem with hunger. So in 2011, the new value chain project was launched in northern Mozambique, if you remember the map, in Nampula. And by the end of 2011, the Nampula Brewery, CDM's Nampula Brewery, had released Impala, the world's very first cassava-based commercial beer. The beer was released to incredible international fanfare. There were, I mean, you can look up the sort of news on this great initiative that was so much about like improving the lives of poor Africans and also introducing this great new beer. At the time, it was only 25 metakaish. It's now, as you see on that poster, that's a picture I took a couple of years ago. 30 metakaish now is less than 50 cents US, so it's quite a bit cheaper. It's able to be cheaper because the government introduced a new law saying that if you were producing cassava beer, you didn't have to pay, they removed the excise tax, which enabled cassava beer to be priced more cheaply than the Mozambique breweries' other beers that were made from wheat and barley. So the government was involved in promoting this beer as well. This was a very big, very sort of high-profile project. By 2013, CDM, the brewer, claimed to have sold 15 million bottles of Impala, representing 4,500 tons of cassava, purchased from over 2,000 farmers. And that year, the SAB Miller won the Best Corporate Social Responsibility Prize at the International Food and Beverage Awards award in what year that was, 2012, where they went and marketed the Impala project under the sort of banner heading "Farming Better Futures." So SAB Miller got a lot of really great international press around the Impala initiative. Now, encouraged by this success, SAB Miller and DATCO decided to extend the value chain into southern Mozambique, and this is where the area where I'm doing research, Zavala, comes in. So down to this area, which is another high cassava producing area, DATCO moved and established another sort of scaled up into the south in 2015. The advantage of moving, and so they were up here first, and then they extended and established another Ampu station down here. The advantage of the southern location being that it was located, where are we? Oh, in Yambani, so this is a bigger map. This is just the province itself. The advantage being that this is the national highway that runs right up and down the coast of Mozambique, goes right through Zavala, this major cassava producing area, and connects right down ultimately to the capital city right here, where there is a big brewery, and more important, a gigantic uncaptured market of poor urban consumers living in sort of rings of settlements around the capital city. So they launched the initiative first in Inyambani up here in Morambene, and then that was in 2013. In 2015, they then moved out and introduced another extension of the project in Zavala. And again, national media praised this. The language around this initiative was just kind of incredible. Talked about this phase of the initiative as a utopian dream and praised Impala as a truly Mozambican product with distinctive national flavor, the pride of our field. So it was something that the government and the media really made a big deal about it. Part of their excitement came from the fact, just keep going here, there we go. Part of their excitement came from the fact that in the south, unlike in Nampula, the vast majority of people who were growing cassava were women. And in the north, in Nampula, there was a higher percentage of men growing cassava just because that was that region's history. In the south of the country, south of Mozambique, which I just talked about, those of you who are here from Food and Empire, we talked about this morning. Southern Mozambique has a long history as a reserve of migrant labor for the mines in South Africa. So women in this part of the country, since about the 1860s, had really taken over most agricultural work. So if you're talking about introducing an initiative to commercialize cassava in southern Mozambique, you know that 80% of the people you're working with are going to be women. So they were very excited, thank you, very excited about this aspect of working in the South as well, because of their idea that women earning income would directly benefit food security, because women their maternal instincts would lead them to want to use all their new income to buy food. There are a lot of stereotypes about African men that they would just spend their cash on drinking or buying stuff for themselves, and so they were very excited that in the South they could start a project that was really targeting a majority of women. So in 2015 they get started in Zavala. This is information about the research just a bit about Zavala District, and just to give you a sense of the sources that we used. So I've done 3 trips to Zavala now. In 2016, we did a baseline survey where we surveyed and interviewed 129 women from 15 different communities. Then I did a lot of interviews with farmer associations and also government officials and people in NGOs working as part of the project. And this, by 2015, this DATCO had begun working in Zavala, and without, I should add, doing any kind of study beforehand to figure out whether this was a good idea. So they'd done well up in Nampula. They thought, okay, we're doing great, let's just move in the south. So they basically just installed a new AMPU platform in 2 places in Inhambane and went down and started working there. When we arrived to do our research in July of 2016, we were told by government officials that cassava was the district's flag because it was so important to the district, it was going to lead the way in the district's economic development. The president himself of Mozambique, Filipe Nyusi, had instructed all of the districts to choose their crop, choose the crop that would lead their development, and Zavala had chosen cassava. And everybody that we talked to in the local government was 100% in favor of this DATCO initiative and of turning cassava into a cash crop. It was ironic because nobody in Zavala then had tasted Impala because it had never been marketed there. It was only marketed in the north of the country. So everybody was like, this is a great idea. We don't know if it's any good, but yeah, we need to do it. So these men that we interviewed in the district government, their conversations were peppered with language that comes from Green Revolution discourse. They talked incessantly about value additions, about value chains, and they also really liked to joke about the women that they were working with. And this is where we started to hear a lot of stereotypes about how ignorant and childish and backward rural farmers were, which was a clue that we realized pretty quickly to the fact that things were not really going as they'd hoped they would go in Zavala, that DACA was experiencing some resistance to the scheme there. So to give you, I had thought when I got there that everything that DACA was doing swimmingly, because this is a picture of all their cassava. This is from 2016, and the raw roots waiting to be processed, and this is a picture of the crates full of bags of processed roots. So it looks like they're raking in the cassava and they're doing really well. But apparently, DACA was quite far from meeting their target for 2016. So this was sort of our introduction to the region, or to the area, and what started us really digging into questions about why this might be the case and what's going on. Now, I know time is running short, and I have so much more to say, but I will try to be quick. So, outside of government offices, when we left the interviews with district officials and went to talk with women, we started to hear very, very different stories about this project and what it meant to them and what they understood was going on. And to hear women talk about cassava in this area is to really get an entirely different perspective on the Green Revolution for Africa and what it actually means on the ground in specific places and specific times. Cassava is not just the leading crop in the district, and these are results of our 2016 baseline survey. So it's the crop that people grow more of than anything else, but beyond that, it occupies a very, very special place in people's culture and cuisine and in their histories and in their social relationships. Zavala, I don't know how well you can see it, is a gorgeous area, very lush. You probably can't see at all the landscape there, but take my word for it, it's very lush. And grows all kinds of different crops, but including many different staple food crops, cassava, maize, there's also still some sorghum, peanuts and beans, so it's a very healthy agricultural system. It has a wealth of fruit trees, coconut palms, seafood, fish. It's just, there are a lot of, the food supply in Zavala naturally is quite good. But Zavala residents are absolutely adamant that their cuisine is centered around cassava, and that cassava is the most important food. And you cannot budge them from that position. People eat this root, the starchy root, at least once a day. Again, these are answers to our questions about how important cassava was to them. 32% of our survey sample ate cassava 1 to 3 times daily. So I would say that's like maybe even more than bread consumed by the average person in our food system, in our society. So cassava, very important, very valued. It's prepared in all kinds of ways. I can talk more about this later, but I will just sort of zip past, except this one, shikaba, which is so treasured This is like a big lump of cake made with cassava, flour, and ground cashews and coconut milk and a lot of sugar. And this is Alcina, one of my assistants, who sat in the car with it on his lap for the 5-hour drive from Zavala back to Maputo because it was so precious he didn't want anything to happen to it. So cassava means a lot in this area. Its leaves are very rich in micronutrients and are used to make matapa, so there are lots of dishes that are very dependent on cassava. And all of this, despite the enormous labor that goes into making cassava, because, as those of you in my classes I hope remember, the root contains cyanide, so you have to do extensive processing to detoxify cassava. These are pictures that I took in Zavala of women grating the root in preparation for roasting it, which there's a pit under there with fire, and women spend hours sitting, they spend hours peeling it, they spend hours grating it, they spend hours roasting it. So cassava is not easy, and yet it is the absolute center still of their cuisine. And so treasured is it that women refer to cassava as their cradle, using a metaphor that is obviously kind of related to an object that holds and nurtures human life at its very beginning. There's this belief that came up again and again in our interviews that cassava had this unbelievable sort of life-sustaining power, that you couldn't survive without, and women literally said that, you couldn't survive without cassava, that even beyond that, biological existence couldn't be conceived of without cassava. And this phrase, we live by cassava, hahanya himpao, the verb kuhanya in Shopi gets used a lot, and it means life, but it means life in the sense of like existing and being well and being a community that was prospering. And so this idea of cassava's centrality to existence here was really, really important. One woman said to us, kind of, it was a little shocking, she said if she didn't have cassava, she would kill her children with hunger. So extremely, extremely central to the food system and to cultural identity in this area. So it's not surprising then that when outsiders came talking about turning cassava into a cash crop, commercializing, buying up all of their cassava and using it to make a commercial beer, not surprising that they met some resistance from women in Zavala. And when we arrived in 2016, women were complaining loudly everywhere we went about the project. And the ways they complained about it were very, very interesting, and have sort of led to me doing a lot of very deep historical research into what cassava means here. On the surface, women's complaints sounded pretty basic. They complained a lot about the low purchase price. So DATCO was buying cassava roots from women for 2 meticais per kilo, which amounted to about 3 cents US per kilo. Can you imagine? I mean, it's almost nothing. It's so close to nothing, it might as well be nothing. But they only got that purchase price if they were able to transport the cassava themselves to the Ampu site, which nobody could do because nobody has transportation. So if DATCO had to send its truck out to get the cassava, they only paid 1.5 meticais per kilo, which was like 2 cents, 2.5 cents, 2 cents. So really very little. This myth of this technology is that it's actually not very mobile. It goes and sits in one place in a district and it doesn't move for 6 months. And so basically you still have to bring all your cassava there to get it processed. But what was more interesting and sort of more startling, women were accusing DATCO of cheating them with their purchase price and of extorting them. And this is, I've got the English and then the Shopi over there. But what we kept hearing again and again were accusations that were quite startling, that DATCO were beating them, were crippling them, were killing them with their practices. And women didn't just sort of say this jokingly. They said it shouting, if we were in the car and stopped and saw somebody outside and they knew we were working on cassava, they would sort of shout this to us. So this language was very meaningful, and people made these accusations very, very loudly and very angrily, as though somehow the company, the DATCO, the project, was causing them this really grievous collective bodily harm, was threatening the life of the district. We asked women if DATCO was doing any of these things literally, and they just all said no, 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 and were sort of surprised that we would have taken them literally. But I think the ferocity of their language and of the imagery they're using really identified the value chain as an existential threat, and one that women felt in particular, and really revealed sort of how precarious they felt their lives were in the face of this effort. Now I know I have to stop so we can have some time for questioning, and I have of course like 20 more pages, but summing up, a couple things. What went wrong? Why were women so upset? And I should say, as a way of excusing my having too much information, is that we're still so in the middle of this project that we're still like very in the weeds and very trying to figure everything out. But 4 things that women did that the project really messed up. One, they assumed that all women were the same. They ignored the fact that there were very significant class differences in access to the project. Really only, this is where the AMPA was stationed, right here, and this is the area of the highest cassava production in the district, where people are already better off, already more affluent, already have trucks. The vast majority of the district, where people are much poorer, had no access to the project. So already there was inequity built into the project, and women reacted in very different ways, including on the sort of higher extreme. This woman, who had become quite wealthy through her cassava production because she was very politically well connected to her husband. She was a sort of donor darling. She was on TV in Mozambique. She was in like publicity materials for development organizations working in agriculture. She was building a new house and big new water cisterns, and she was doing super well through her cassava production. She was one extreme, and she was very unusual, I mean exceptional, but she was held up by the project as a real kind of illustration of what was possible. So one thing that they really got wrong is the project, the value chain, is that they, in assuming that all rural women were just poor subsistence farmers with no access to the market, they were completely, that doesn't account for a woman like this woman, Felicidad Chico. Second thing they did wrong was in imposing and again, this is something I'm going to talk more about in the discussion, imposing this new set of agricultural technologies in a setting where people had been farming very successfully for hundreds and hundreds of years. So this is an example of the demonstration fields that DACO set up with the partners, where there are experiments using different cassava varieties with different fertilizers and different spacings and different doses. This is another example of a field. Women were not thrilled about these invasions. One, because they were used to intercropping cassava. This is an example. This is beans, corn, and where the cassava go, and the cassava is right here. Intercrop together because they nourish each other, the plants, because women, it reduces the amount of weeding that's required if they're grown together. It reduces the vulnerability to pests if plants from different species are grown together. This is how women have been growing cassava for a very, very long time. The project wants them to grow it like this, very close together, monocropping. This was something women didn't like. They had a lot of reasons, and they were correct for why it wasn't a good idea. The thing that most upset women is that they started to hear talk that the project was going to start requiring people to buy the seeds, the approved varieties, and to buy the fertilizers and the herbicides. And this was unheard of. The idea that you would commercialize seed material is something that really sent women kind of around the bend. Because seed material is something, if you have a chance to read the quotes, women exchange seeds. Women don't sell seeds. Women know, and these are just examples of many, many different quotes we have, that when you need seeds, you ask a friend, you ask a relative, you ask a neighbor. When somebody needs them, they come to you and you always give them to them. Why? Because you're part of this big network where people want to support each other, and where how you treat each other around the production of food is like the center of who you are and how you're going to survive as a community. So this was another point where women became alienated from the project. Third, really quickly, it has to do with the miscalculated impact of the project. And it's too early to really know the effect on food security and nutrition of this project, but so far this is how women spent the money they made from selling their cassava their first year. And you'll see that food represents 59%. So the project, the Green Revolution for Africa, sort of assumes that everybody's going to spend all their earnings on food because people are hungry. In fact, priorities, home improvement, buying things to rebuild your household. Remember, this is a place that suffered from a long civil war. Education was a big one. And the food, when they bought food, they bought processed food, white rice, white sugar, vegetable oil, a kind of peanuts that came from South Africa, and stock powder. These were the foodstuffs they bought. Why? Because these were the foods that were associated, you can see in the quote up here, with affluence and high status. So as a result of Portuguese colonialism, the idea is if you were going to be sort of civilized and respectable, you ate rice, you had tea with sugar, you cooked in vegetable oil, not traditional oil that you made from a natural plant in the area. So even the foods that they were buying with their cassava income didn't I'm going to leave this, conform to the model. Now, the worst thing that they did, the most kind of wrong-headed thing that DACO did, and this, I'll stop after this point, is by going into Zavala with the assumption that cassava had never been anything other than a subsistence crop, and that women had never sold it, and that they didn't know anything about markets. In fact, cassava was introduced from Brazil into Mozambique in the this is in the south, in the mid-1700s. It was in Zavala by about 1800, and from the moment of its arrival, it was not a subsistence crop. It was a crop that women grew. They processed the roots, they made it into flour, and they sold it. Where? Why? Because that section of the southern Mozambican coast at this time, right along here, the same time that cassava arrived, late 1700s, the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, made its way around the Cape of Good Hope to the Indian Ocean coast of Africa. And Inhambane port became, up here, a major site of the export of African captives by the mid-1700s. Then in the early 1800s, this region was conquered by an offshoot of the Zulu Empire from South Africa. They conquered this area, and they too engaged in slave trading and captured a lot of women to work as domestic servants. So the era when cassava became this central crop in this region was completely associated with slave trading, slave raiding, warfare, violence, desperate insecurity. And cassava represented a plant that women could not only grow and use as a reliable food source because it grows in any growing conditions, but it was a crop they could also sell. They could process and sell, because with all the slaving, those of you in here who've read the Carney and Rosamoff book about the slave trade in foods, cassava flour was the food that fueled the Atlantic slave trade. And so there was a huge new market for cassava flour among ship captains and slave traders and wandering merchants who were part of this trade in this whole area. So cassava arrived in southern Mozambique in the context of terrible violence. And women's association of cassava with like physical danger, I think, is what sort of echoes through their responses to the DACO project today.